This week on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, Kevin Spacey apparently missed that Frank Underwood is the bad guy.
Or he was very well cast.
Emily Zanotti of the Daily Wire explains the Spaceywood sex abuse scandal.
To fast-track that money directly through organizations that are already on the ground and not through the bureaucracy of the UN, it makes total sense.
Philippe Nassif of In Defense of Christians explains the Trump administration's decision to sidestep the UN and give aid directly to Christians in the Middle East.
I don't actually think you can tell a good story that is not in some sense conservative and not in some sense Christian.
Andrew Klavan, screenwriter, novelist, and host of The Andrew Klavan Show, gives his thoughts about the future of the culture wars.
In the early days of broadcasting, few people realized what a fine art radio was to become.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the show that Terry Gross and Robert Siegel listen to when they're out of ideas. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid.
I have it on the best authority, my dear. If we drove the Catholics out of all the government jobs, we could run this nation properly for the right people.
Thank you, Emily Zanotti, senior editor of the Daily Wire, for joining us today to talk about all of the things that I'm sure you're sick of talking about, namely Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and other four-letter words from Hollywood.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So we just heard the news. I mean, I don't want to talk too much about Weinstein because he's been talked to death.
Right.
But breaking news about Kevin Spacey, particularly gut-wrenching and gross. His response, which was essentially, yeah, I may have tried to molest a 14-year-old and something, I'm gay.
Yeah, it's a bizarre response. So back when he was 26 years old, so he was considerably older than Anthony Rapp, who was the other actor in this story, he invited the young child, 14-year-old child, to a party, and then when everyone else had left, he picked up the kid, threw him on the bed, and then laid on top of him, which is insane. And of course, the kid freaked out. He definitely knew it was a sexual advance. He escaped, locked himself in the bathroom until Kevin Spacey allowed him to leave. There are so many weird angles to this story, but he's just like, well, you know, I got drunk, and then I did something that was kind of weird. That's not exactly a great excuse. Let me put it that way.
Well, yeah, and so you and I are both Catholic, correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Great. Here at the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, we're both Catholic. But we've lived through the whole faith-shaking phenomenon of the Catholic sex abuse crisis, right? Now, that largely involved homosexual men getting into the priesthood, and they engaged in what the Boston Globe initially reported as predominantly ephebophilia. The most common category of young men victimized by these priests were around the age of Rapp at the time when
14,
Kevin Spacey went.
16 years old. Just
right.
Short of being legal. Mm-hmm.
Right. So we've seen this before, right? So I feel like Catholics should be really outspoken about this and say, hey, you know what? We might have an insight or two about this because we just saw it happen and it was a disaster and it ruined the moral influence of our institution. And then Hollywood, faced with the exact same problem as far as I can tell, they're not handling it the way they should. They're handling it like Kevin Spacey handled it.
Right. And every time, even going back to Harvey Weinstein, when he was talking about what had happened, he said, you know, well, this is just the way it is, and it's been this way forever, and my contract with my company says that I'm allowed to do these things, and they just don't have any part of it. It's this weird, we're going to keep on telling you that we are the moral conscience of America. Meanwhile, we are covering up en masse. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Weinstein and Spacey are just the more available allegations. We know that there are thousands more underneath this water. And so it's just strange for them to keep saying we are the moral conscience of America and yet turn around and every time it's one of these guys who's been preaching about his own moral superiority for decades.
You know, you could argue that Hollywood and the entertainment industry at large is as great a moral influence and a moral leader in our culture as the Catholic Church maybe was in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
So it's a very similar kind of expose. Like these people who are almost like our spiritual leaders,
right.
Turns out they're dirty.
They're dirty.
It's a very similar experience, isn't it?
Especially when you look at people like George Clooney and actually Harvey Weinstein. George Clooney actually just had a movie come out called Suburbicon, which portrays sort of the deep, seedy underbelly of middle century America and how how these women and men who looked like they were super perfect on the outside and had these wonderful family lives, how they were just seething with racism and murder right underneath the surface. And the point of that movie was to try to moralize and teach you that you need to confront things like your racism and your own demons in order to get to a higher, more progressive plane. And at the same time, Clooney is going out and doing these interviews and being asked about Harvey Weinstein and saying, well, you know, this is something that we're just going to have to deal with, and it's rampant in every industry, and Hollywood isn't special. We're taking responsibility for our problem. And that's not entirely true. It's a bizarre breakdown where they considered themselves a moral force and then got so insular that they couldn't see when that was breaking down on the inside.
Right. And actually, you know what? Spacey looks the part.
Right.
He looks kind of like a 1950s priest. And he is a priest, is my point. Mm-hmm. He's a priest in the sense that he is a leader in a morally influential institution that everyone looks up to and would never suspect. Not only because he's a leading member of the entertainment industry, but he's trying to pull off the same thing by being a leader in the LGBT community. He wants to join the LGBT community because I think that what he's thinking is that entering the LGBT community in 2017, like entering the seminary in 1970, is a way to get access to young boys and to have enough social esteem that you can keep those boys quiet if you take advantage of them.
Yeah, it's transacting in power and joining a group that allows you to transact in that power because they have political influence. So no one's going to touch Kevin Spacey, or so he thinks, because he's going to be part of this group that will defend him simply because of who he is.
Right.
And he believes he can continue to engage in this sort of behavior or write it off as though it were nothing because he's going to have an army of people around him that will defend him at every opportunity. And Weinstein did the same thing. The very first thing that Weinstein came out and said was, well, I'm going to take on the NRA. Well, that's such a strange thing to say at the onset of a sexual allegation. Like, I'm going to go after the guns if you guys just leave me alone.
Right.
That's kind of calling in the wagon.
Don't worry, I'm one of you. It's the equivalent of saying it's the equivalent of saying I was just accused of molesting boys, but don't worry, I'm a really good Catholic. Well, no.
Right. I'm so good. I'm paying for kneelers. Like, this is going to be great, guys.
Well, it's kind of okay. So what do you think? Here's another angle. Deadline Hollywood put out the headline, Netflix pulls plug on House of Cards next year after Kevin Spacey sexual advances claims. I rewrote that headline as Netflix pulls plug on perversity normalizing show about powerful bisexual lecher when it is revealed that Star is actual powerful bisexual lecher. Right? Yeah. So in other words, Kevin Spacey apparently missed the fact that Frank Underwood is the bad guy.
Or he was very well cast.
Right, or he was very well, exactly. But I'm wondering, what do you think, Emily, of the messaging of the content of Hollywood itself? In other words, Hollywood's entertainment content is pretty filthy. What do you think of that? Is that connected with these discoveries that these people are actually filthy in their real lives?
Well, I think when you look at someone like Harvey Weinstein, you can see sort of the degradation in his own life give rise to degradation in arts and culture. The movies that he's made have gotten increasingly bizarre. In fact, look at Woody Allen. Woody Allen's latest film features an older man preying on a 14 or 15-year-old girl. So art imitates life in the sense that life imitates art. These sort of depraved individuals have brought a lot of this down with them. It really does seem like what we've seen lately, sort of the degradation of the movie industry, things getting more violent, more sexual, more explicit, also seems to coincide with a lot of these directors rising to power.
And you know what? It's not satirical. Here's the cool thing, though. There's a conservative backlash going on, conservative and libertarian backlash. I see it all over the place. I see it with you at the Daily Wire. I see it at the Conservative Review. It's what I'm trying to do here with Catholic Vote and CatholicVote Radio Hour. There's this sort of ability to be satirical. And you know what? It can include smutty content. It can include that stuff, but it doesn't portray it as something glorious and wonderful. You can push back against evil, portraying it realistically. And Hollywood has lost track of that. It's like I remember when I was a teenager, teenagers try out various personas, right, before they mature. Well, my persona, when I was a singer-songwriter starting out, my persona on stage was an arrogant jerk on stage. That was my stage persona. And one time, a girlfriend of mine pulled me aside and said, you know what? If you pretend to be a jerk, you in effect, are a jerk if you never stop pretending to be a jerk. I think Hollywood's kind of going through that, and hopefully they have a self-awakening.
Well, the fun part about working for the Daily Wire and what I get to do every day is that we get freedom to do it. And I think you get more of that freedom when you're storming the gates. The culture is really stacked against us. When we're at the Daily Wire every day, day in and day out, we're commenting on culture. We realize that we're sort of in the minority compared to a huge Hollywood entity. So it's been really fun to be able to make fun of them and poke fun at them and get under their skin just a little bit with a lot of personality.
Amen. And you do it very well. And I can't wait to have you on again, Emily. Visit regularly. I love your commentary.
Absolutely. I would love to.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm joined now by Philippe Nassif. He's the executive director of In Defense of Christians. He's joining us for a very timely conversation about a decision made by the Trump administration to go right around the UN to give direct aid to Christians in the Middle East, particularly to institutions that are doing the most to take care of refugees in the Middle East. And first of all, Philippe, thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So this is something that I've paid attention to since 2014, and clergy in particular in the Middle East who have done the most to help those displaced by the rise of radical Islam and particularly of ISIS have been begging for this for years, haven't they?
Absolutely. It's been many, many years of sort of pleas from the Christian community for additional direct help. And, we've worked really hard. Our organization, In Defense of Christians, has worked very hard to sort of change the way, not just the way the United States sort of views persecuted minorities in the region, but also how we deliver direct aid to these people.
What is the immediate implication of the fact that the UN is no longer directly involved in sort of curating aid from the U.S. to those in need in the Middle East?
Iraq has faced over a decade of war. And so there's a lot of rebuilding and a lot of rehabilitation to be done across the whole country. But we were asking the United Nations to double down its efforts to help these minorities because they've faced extinction. They were literally being driven out of Iraq and exterminated, and all traces of their existence exterminated, from graveyards and olive groves to homes and then people. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted the United Nations to sort of double down and say, these people are facing particularly unique circumstances that could lead to their complete eradication. And we need to do as much as possible to get aid to them as quickly as possible and prioritize them.
Right.
It's not to say that we don't care about everybody else, it's to say that these people face particularly dire circumstances. The United Nations was unwilling to do that, in short, for a variety of reasons. And so it's been a lot of conversations and a lot of lobbying and a lot of advocacy to sort of get the United States government to make a switch and to send the money that it was appropriating to the United Nations for these areas to then go directly through the United States government to other organizations on the ground.
Well, one little known fact, one thing that I think is really underrated and underknown in the West is many of the pleas that have come from Christians who are most hard hit by the rise of ISIS, they have had nothing to do with refugee resettlement, right? So, I mean, there's been plenty of hand-wringing and narrative-driven, emotional, passionate talk in the West about the plight of people hurt by ISIS, but a lot of it kind of tends to miss the central points that are being made by the people in the Middle East themselves, and that tends to not focus quite so much on refugee resettlement as aid to the people there who are waiting out the destruction of ISIS, after which they would like to return home. Isn't that right?
That's exactly correct. Look, people in the region have been talking about this issue for a long time. Persecution didn't just begin with the rise of ISIS. It's been around for a long time in the region. Refugees that fled, that made it to the United States, who were lucky enough to make it here, have been talking about this for a long time. And we've made it a priority of our organization to sort of change the way we deliver aid and get help to these communities. There's a lot of people in DC that say their issue is of utmost importance. And, it's the end of the world if we don't fix this problem. But I mean, I can say with full confidence, that if not just our organization, but all of the other organizations that work in this space have not been ferociously ringing the alarm bells that these communities were literally going to be wiped off the face of this earth within a matter of months, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, Stephen. We wouldn't be talking about this. We would be talking about how there was once a community in Iraq for thousands of years that is no longer there because we didn't do anything about it.
Wow. So how would you contrast your interactions? Because I know you've been doing a lot of, you and other organizations on behalf of Christians in the Middle East and other minorities in the Middle East, you've been lobbying and you've been making a lot of efforts to be a good voice for them in D.C. for years. How would you contrast your experience with the Obama administration with the experience you've had with, say, Vice President Mike Pence?
I mean, I think that we've had more progress made under the current administration. Mm-hmm. I really don't buy the notion that the previous administration didn't really care about these issues. Mm-hmm. I mean, we got the genocide declaration done during the Obama administration.
Right, John Kerry in 2015.
That's right. Now, they push back on it because mainly no administration wants to sort of have a genocide happen under their watch.
Right.
We've had some issues with the current administration regarding, refugee resettlement in the United States and how we've, at some point not allowed anybody with an Iraqi passport into the United States, and that includes Christians, and here we are saying, wait a minute, these are the people that are getting killed off. So in short, I'll say that we've had more progress under the current administration. I think that the vice president is personally very invested in this issue. Yeah. I think the president does as well, and many people in the administration. But also, I don't want to take the credit away from a lot of the other people like yourselves giving me the opportunity to talk about this to your audience and all of the other folks that care about these issues who've advocated and pushed and educated and reached out to Americans of all faiths and let them know just that there are Christians in the Middle East to begin with, right, and that they're facing the threat of annihilation. I mean, that there takes years of advocacy and work, and now we're seeing it pay off with results.
Right. So one of the things that does, I think, help a little is this sort of underdog narrative, the sort of rebellious narrative that, there's a lot of talk in politics in Europe and in the U.S. In which increasingly the UN and the EU and other sort of legacy organizations that are in charge of ensuring the safety and well-being of people are being seen in a more and more negative light. And the Trump administration, by the way, falls into this. A lot of the rhetoric we've heard in 2016 and beyond with Brexit and so forth has that sort of tone of, the UN, the EU, none of it's trustworthy. This is all, kind of cynical and nasty politics. We're going to get real now. You know what I mean?
Right.
What are some ways that actually might play out and translate into reality in terms of our being able to get past or around the UN with our aid to those in need in the Middle East?
I think that you're going to get some pushback from, different elected officials and folks that sort of don't want to see the UN sideline on this particular issue. Whether that actually stymies the implementation of the changes remains to be seen. I doubt that that's really going to happen. We just heard this policy announcement last week, and we're seeing it rolled out already. This was smart, the way the administration did it. We can't wait for Baghdad's political settlements and Kurdish referendums to finish, and we got to do it now. And so to fast track that money directly through organizations that are already on the ground and not through the bureaucracy of the UN it makes total sense.
And thank you for articulating why that makes sense and for doing so for years, going to Washington. It's a thankless job, and you've worked hard at it, and we're very grateful to you. And I'm sure those who are the most hard hit by radical Islam and brutalities in the Middle East are also grateful as well. Say hi to them for me. I'm sure you're in touch with a lot of people on the ground there.
I certainly will, and thank you for giving me the time to talk about this with you.
All right. God bless.
Take care.
Well, we've come to that time in the Catholic Vote Radio Hour where we have our weekly political discussion with Catholic Vote Political Director Josh Mercer. How you doing, Josh?
Hey, great to be with you.
Thanks for coming on. And this week, the transgender military ban. We've got some judges rejecting Trump's actions with the military policy again, right?
Well, this is a case where Trump was just reverting the policy back to what it had been before Obama came into office. Obama had done it through an executive order, and Donald Trump decides to return the policy to what it had been before through the same sort of executive order. Well, what happens? A judge in a federal court threw it out and put a block on it and stopped Trump's policy. This just, to me, highlights the importance of judges as an issue.
We're talking about a policy that is a year old, and they're talking about it as if it is dogma from the first century church.
Right. I mean, it's amazing that you're right. It wasn't even in existence a year or two ago, and now suddenly it's infallible. The progression of the left, it's bewildering. The pace at which it goes, and apparently with no brakes. You know, again, this just highlights the critical importance of judges. I mean, people don't realize this. I mean, the Supreme Court has, unfortunately, way too much power. But so many of these important cases don't even make it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court only handles a handful of cases every year. Now, of course, so many of these cases get handled at the circuit court level, federal court, but they're at the circuit court level. So, like, for example, no matter what you think about the travel ban, that got shut down in a federal court in Hawaii. So it was really important to get Neil Gorsuch on the United States Supreme Court, no question about it. But it remains critically important to fill so many of these vacancies. Donald Trump came into office. There's over 100 vacancies on the federal court. And actually, the slow rate of confirmations through the Senate, Stephen, there are more vacancies now than there were 9 months ago.
Wow. It's an important battleground. You know, there's a lot of sort of superficial punditry out there about SJWs and cultural Marxism, and a lot of it focuses on sort of skirmishes on the streets. But you know where the real SJW threats are? They're wearing black robes. I mean, Roe v. Wade itself, that was some radical leftism, but it was done by the suits, the presentable public, dignified arm of the pink-haired SJWs we hear so much about, and they're more effective.
It's a legal anarchy. I mean, there's so many times where the left has transformed American life through judicial usurpation.
Actually, Josh, you're really sharp on this subject. You've told me before about how much the court matters, and it can be misleading to think about the times when Republicans were quote-unquote in power, but because the court wasn't in our control, things nevertheless moved toward the cultural left in a way that hurt people. Isn't that right?
Well, it was not the President of the United States that ended prayer in public schools. That was done by the court. It wasn't an act of Congress that gave us legalized abortion in all 50 states. That was a decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court. And I live in Michigan, and we had the chance as people of Michigan to go ahead and vote at the ballot box, and we said we want marriage between a man and a woman. And it was the United States Supreme Court that said, no way, no how, you must change your law.
Wow.
So again and again, conservatives, pro-lifers win at the ballot box only to get sidelined by the courts. And so a lot of hard work gets undercut if we don't finish the job and change the judiciary to get people who obey the rule of law and understand the Constitution the way it is.
Yeah, that's really disheartening, actually. But this year, we see an opportunity to push back on that in the judiciary, right?
Right. In fact, we got 4 nominees for the circuit court coming up. And in fact, one of them is Amy Barrett.
The one within whom the dogma lives loudly.
Yes, that's exactly that. It was Senator Dianne Feinstein, super liberal from California. She said that in a way that was intended to be an indictment of Amy Barrett's Catholicism, but in fact, it's a badge of honor.
Yeah.
She's got a very solid legal foundation for her principles and her ideas. She stressed that if there ever were a case where her Catholicism made it impossible for her to do her job, that she would resign. She wouldn't suddenly force people to become Catholics through the judiciary. I mean, what nonsense.
Wouldn't it be nice if Feinstein and others were to say sometime that, hey, you know what, if my cultural Marxism ever conflicts with the Constitution, I will recuse myself?
Right. I mean, Dianne Feinstein is one
What about
that has
their
been,
religion?
Right, exactly. Her dogmatism is actually more rigid and inflexible. As far as she's concerned, she will torture and manipulate the United States Constitution and every single law that we have to ensure that we have legal abortion, because that's the only thing that matters to her.
Right.
You know, any other principle needs to be subjugated to that right in her mind to kill an unborn child.
My gosh. Well, what do you think the turnaround will look like? If we can gain some control in the judiciary, do you think we can spark a fire that'll spell a 180 in our culture at some point? Is that possible?
You know, it's certainly a great opportunity for us, and we need to take advantage of it. I mean, one of the things that the Senate is doing, obviously voting today, hopefully to confirm all 4 of these nominees. But what we need to do, though, is keep putting the pressure on our senators and say, you know what? We need to push through more of these nominees. A lot of these nominees that have been up since May or June, they're finally getting a vote, and others that are July and August. We need to move these things through. Maybe it takes the Senate 24/7, 6-7 days a week, working through this and getting these nominees through, getting them confirmed, putting them on the bench, and move this pipeline along. I mean, so that the president can nominate even more candidates for the bench. We didn't get into this mess overnight. We're not going to solve it in a day either.
Right.
The reform of the judiciary is a long process, but we've we've made a lot of headway, and let's keep it going.
So what are some things that our listeners and you and I could directly do to try to push this forward?
Well, Catholic Vote, we've been pressuring the Senate with ads out there on social media, encouraging people to call Congress, tell their senators, look, we don't need a debate for 30 hours after every nominee. 8 hours in the United States Senate should be plenty of time to discuss whether or not a nominee is good or not. We can't have a 3-day week in the Senate. Have it 5, 6, 7 days. Have long hours. Make the Democrats speak at 4 a.m. if they want to try to stop one of these nominees. Otherwise, let's get them through. Let's get them confirmed, and let's move on to the business of the American people.
All right, that sounds good. Now, Josh, as the editor of the Catholic Vote Loop, do you promise to keep us in the loop on this?
Well, obviously, the issue of judges is something that's very interesting to a lot of Catholics. It's one of the major reasons why Catholics voted in 2016. So, yes, if you want to stay up to date on these, you want to keep in the loop, subscribe to our free daily email newsletter at catholicvote.org/loop.
Awesome. Sounds good. I can't wait to talk to you next week, Josh.
Thanks, Stephen.
All right, God bless.
My name is Andrew Klavan, and this is a story I wrote called Another Kingdom, performed by Michael Knowles. Today, in episode 1...
Suddenly, I was in a stone room hung with tapestries. There was a woman lying on the floor. She was beautiful, and she was dead.
Welcome back. What you were just listening to was the very beginning of a podcast, which is the latest novel of my guest right now, Andrew Klavan. It's called Another Kingdom. Andrew, you just launched it as a podcast for people to listen to with regular updates. Isn't that right?
Yes, every Friday there's a new episode coming out. It's kind of an experiment for me.
Well, you are primarily a novelist. I mean, that's your whole background is you've been a novelist, you've been a screenwriter, you wrote True Crime, which was made into a Clint Eastwood movie, and you were part of the sort of Hollywood elite. Whatever made you leave that high tower to be among the commoners, Andrew?
Well, funnily enough, I mean, I never wanted to work in Hollywood. I only ever wanted to be a novelist. That's all I wanted to do. The first time anybody offered me a screenwriting job, I turned them down. I'm probably the only person I know who's ever done that. But they kept asking me, and finally somebody actually went out and purchased a book that I had mentioned and said, well, now you have to adapt it. And so I did. And for a while, it was always a sideline. I was always mainly a novelist. But for a while, I did quite well. And I was selling scripts. And as any screenwriter will tell you, not every script you sell gets made, but you still make your money by selling the scripts. And then I started to have a political voice.
Right.
And whether it was a coincidence or not, I don't really think it was. As the war on terror got underway and as Hollywood started making movies opposing the war on terror while our soldiers were in the field, which they'd never done before. You know, they made anti-Vietnam movies, but they made them after our soldiers came home. I started to write articles saying, no, whether you agree with the war or not, this is wrong. You don't make a Hollywood movie, which is a powerful propaganda instrument, while our guys are in harm's way.
Right.
And my phone pretty much stopped ringing, strange to say. And it really became kind of a problem. I just became toxic. I still get meetings in Hollywood. I still get calls. And every now and again, somebody will lean over and drop his voice to a whisper and say, you know, I really like your political opinions. And I always respond the same way. I always say, why are we whispering? But, but obviously, it's very much a one-party town. I think that's beginning to unravel a little bit. But that's basically the arc of my Hollywood career. And it was always a sideline. I enjoyed doing it because I enjoyed collaborating. But it's very difficult to be honest politically if you're not a far leftist and still work in L.A.
But it's funny, you are like primarily an artist. You would fit into the category that Plato would want illegalized, which is poets.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's really smart. This is where I come from in terms of my way of approaching things as well. The late, great Andrew Breitbart's line that he loved to repeat, you know, of course, politics is downstream from culture. You seem to understand that and operate from that. And I think that we're beginning to see perhaps a groundswell in our favor now. I mean, I've had several people on this show, Jason Jones, Hollywood film producer, a couple of novelists who are wrong thinkers. And I think that if we get out ahead on that, maybe we'll have more influence than if we're just picketing and rallying. What do you think?
Oh, there's no question about it. I mean, I was good friends with Andrew Breitbart, and one of the reasons we got together was because of our recognition that you can win all the elections you want, but if you don't own the culture, the ground is being eaten away under your feet day by day. So what happens is you're out dealing with what you think is the latest political emergency, and suddenly you realize the entire country has changed its mind in some way. Well, when did that happen? It happened when you weren't making television shows, when you weren't writing movies, when you weren't writing novels or rock songs and all those things. And I do think with a new generation, a younger generation coming up, I do think conservatives are beginning to get this message on the one hand. On the other hand, we still face some very interesting challenges. You mentioned Another Kingdom. When I started writing Another Kingdom, I thought, well, this is a story that a Christian audience will like, but the Christian audience always hits me because I let my characters speak as they would really speak in real life. And they always say, oh, you're using 4-letter words and this is a terrible thing.
Right.
So I tried on my first draft. I really did. I left out all the curse words. And when I went back and read it, I thought, this is garbage. This doesn't sound like real human people living in the 21st century at all. And I had to go back and put the curse words in. And so one of the problems we face is that conservatives and Christians make a very big mistake when dealing with culture, which is this. Conservatives and Christians think that conservative Christian culture will look conservative and Christian. It doesn't. If you take a show like The Sopranos, which is filled with violence and nudity and filthy language and horribleness, if you watch that show very carefully, it is a deeply moral, and I would even argue Christian show. And I think that what it does is it kind of silhouettes righteousness. It blacks out everything but the evil so that you can see the righteousness surrounding it. And there even is an episode called From Where to Eternity in The Sopranos where Jesus figures in very deeply and actually performs a miracle in the show.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I know. It's amazing.
Andrew, I wouldn't know that. My mom wouldn't let me watch it.
Exactly. And I think if you hog tie artists so that they can't represent the world as it is, as God made it and as God rules it, then you've got a serious problem because God is not the God of Candyland. He is the God of this very, very difficult, very obscene, very sinful world. Christian art used to be the greatest art on earth. And now I find it very banal and very unrealistic. And I don't think that is going to be triumphant in the end.
That's very sad. Well, you know what? I just watched the movie. I don't know if you saw it, Blade Runner 2049.
I did.
Okay, yeah. Well, I don't know what you thought of it, but I watched it and afterwards I analyzed it with best-selling sci-fi author Robert Cruzy, who's very much a wrong thinker. I mentioned him earlier. Mm-hmm. And he and I agreed that, the way I put it is I said, you and I, Robert, are Christians and pro-lifers. And as Christians and pro-lifers, this movie delivers for us without speaking directly to us, because it addresses the realities that make us pro-life and Christian without being a Christian pro-life preaching movie. You know
That's right.
So, in other words, it just addresses reality, and reality has a tendency to actually justify the truth.
I don't actually think you can tell a good story that is not in some sense conservative and not in some sense Christian.
Wow.
And I think that you actually don't have to preach. You don't even have to say the word Jesus. You don't have to say anything. Just you have to be honest. You have to say, this is the world. This is what actually happens when you live in the world. And this is what people actually think. And weirdly enough, strangely enough, I think you will find the presence of the Spirit and you'll find the presence of good values there. A guy who does what you're talking about is Martin Scorsese. He made that picture, The Wolf of Wall Street, which is as profane as it's possible for a movie to be. And yet at the end of it, all you're thinking is, boy, I'm glad I don't live that life.
Right.
I'm glad I'm not that guy. And that's an amazing feat for an artist to pull off, especially when you have beautiful actresses taking their clothes off. You think, well, that's where I want to be. But in fact, Scorsese actually wrong-foots you in that way. It's very brilliant.
Very interesting. But speaking of which, Andrew, you wrote a book a while back, The Great Good Thing, about your own conversion. You had a conversion to Christianity, and it's relevant to what we were just talking about, because I feel like the way you converted was basically by encountering realities and saying, well, I'm not going to resist that my prejudices happen to conflict with this reality I discovered. In other words, it was evidence-based rather than an ideological push or something.
That's exactly right. I mean, I've had people tell me that I didn't really convert because I didn't have a road to Damascus experience. It was instead the experience of just saying, this makes sense and this doesn't make sense. It was always very, very important to me, even as a little kid, that my thinking made sense. So that if I said something, if I said, well, some things are good and some things are evil, I had to be able to trace that back to some, motivating factor. You couldn't just say, well, I don't like this and that makes it bad, or, it's bad for me, but it's good for you, because I just didn't believe. I came to the point over time where I said to myself, even if everybody on earth is a Nazi, being a Nazi is wrong. And how do you then explain that? And I think, you're right. It was a kind of a twofold thing. One, it was observing reality, and the other, it was observing art, because I loved literature so much, and all the great literature kept leading me back to the Gospels. And that was part of the experience as well. It was starting out reading detective stories, because all I ever wanted to be was a detective story writer, and I would read these detective stories, and they would all kind of circle around King Arthur stories, the Holy Grail, Knights in Armor. And then I'd start to read Knights in Armor, and I'd find, well, gee, that was a Christian Catholic construct. What's that about? And it was like a vortex kind of drawing me in to this central philosophy that has really supported our entire, at least in the West, our entire civilization. And yeah, it was an emotional journey, in the sense that, of course, I had to go myself. I had to journey into some very dark places before I could really accept it. But on the other hand, it was very much an intellectual journey, in that I just wanted, when I opened my mouth and when words came out, I wanted them to make sense. And I couldn't do that until I accepted Christianity. And interestingly enough, it changed everything, because it did make me make sense. It made my art better. It made my thinking better. And, it was a long journey, because I started out, I was not just a Jew, I was a secular Jew. So I was a non-believing Jew. And that's a long way to travel.
Right. Wow. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that you were kind of brought there through the art that you were consuming. The art itself should be reflective of reality and of nature, right? Of the world that we're living in, which God created.
Sure.
It reminds me of what St. Paul said. St. Paul says something to the effect of, you know what? Everyone sees the things of God reflected in his creation, and we're without excuse, is what he says. We all see it.
Yeah.
In other words, he's saying, I'm not just preaching at Christians, I'm talking about mankind, I'm talking about human nature. And it seems like you've tapped into that.
There's a fascinating phenomenon going on right now, that if you read, there's a lot of books by academics, intellectuals, literary critics, all of whom say what's obviously missing from the world right now is Christian faith. There are books like Why We Should Call Ourselves Christians, or The End of Education. These are all by very, intellectual Yale professors and, critics and everything. And they say what's obviously missing is Christian faith, and yet I can't believe. I myself, the author, can't bring myself to believe. And I think that what has happened is a series of philosophers and sometimes political manipulators have created an atmosphere, an intellectual atmosphere that's very hard to break through. One of the very hardest things to do in life is to break out of the atmosphere of your time, to break out of the spirit of the age and see the world afresh. And I think the spirit of our age has been, up till now, an atheist spirit. I think that's been the default setting of intellectual life. I'm not talking about ordinary life. I'm just talking about the life of people who think and write and create. I know in the places I hung out, and I hung out in, literary places and movie places, that if you believed in God, you were a little weird. If you believed in Christ, you were just some kind of nut. You were just out of your mind, And it's very hard to stop and say, oh, all my friends believe X, but really all of nature points to Y. That's a hard thing to do. I believe it's going to happen. I believe there's going to be a renewal of Christian faith, at least in America. I think maybe Europe may be lost. But I think, I know. But I do believe that, because I just simply think it's the only idea that makes sense.
Well, I think you're right. I hope you're right, and I'll pray that you're right. But one thing also that comes to my mind is, going back to college, when I wrote my senior thesis, I discovered the alt-right, before it was called that. We're talking about 2013. And I discovered hangouts online of white racists. One of the main things they talked about is they congratulated Planned Parenthood at reining in the breeding of inferiors.
Yes. Yeah.
And they threw around the N-word a lot. And in my senior thesis, it was like a diatribe against the spirit of the age as I saw it. And it said something like, if you bring up the fact that white racists are gathering online and celebrating the success of Planned Parenthood in, quote, curbing reckless breeding, if you bring that up, people will yell at you for repeating the N-word rather than take note of the fact that blacks are being killed en masse.
That's a great point. It's an absolutely true observation that we are complete. First of all, the abortion has become something that the left so wants to protect and so feels is essential to their philosophy. I agree with them. I think it is essential to their philosophy. And I think that that points to something that is terribly, terribly wrong with their philosophy. And I think that this is the argument. And I always try to argue with people about abortion last, because I think that it is the kind of bedrock of what they're standing on. They're standing on an idea that we can all be equal. They're standing on an idea that we have no nature. They're standing on an idea that there's no moral fabric to the universe, but it's only as we choose it. And I think that abortion is at the very, very heart of that philosophy.
Right.
And I look around and what I see, I see people taking a lot of drugs that are prescription drugs, not just opiates that we're talking about all the time now, but also these antidepressants. And I think antidepressants are very interesting because I think that they have solved the problem of unhappiness, but they have created a problem of despair. And the despair comes from, I'm not like never take antidepressants. I think some people probably need them. They make some sense. But I think that once you say to people that what you are essentially is a bag of chemicals that can be adjusted until you feel just absolutely right, you've taken away from them the meaning of their lives. Right. And once you say to people, you can be free to have all the sex you want, and if it happens that you make a mistake and you get a baby in there, well, you just get rid of it.
Exactly.
You solve the problem of the moment, but you create a much, much bigger problem, not just the problem of exterminating a human life, but the problem of transforming life into something meaningless, into a meat puppet show, essentially. Yeah. And I think that what you have is this spreading despair. And what I think is happening, Stephen, is that we're dividing into the people of hope and the people of despair. The people of despair seem sometimes happier and freer in the moment, but not in the long run by any means.
There's a Wolf of Wall Street with various levels of income.
Exactly.
So I think you're exactly right, especially about that, like getting rid of the lump of cells inside of you, even though you yourself are a lump of cells.
Right.
But this lump of cells happens to be an inconvenient one for you, as if you have a meaning as an I, as an ego. But like you mentioned earlier, dishonesty. That is not an honest description of what is going on, right?
Yes. It's a specific kind of dishonesty that I call intellectual dishonesty, just to have a name for it. It's not lying. It's accepting a worldview that makes no sense. And what I've noticed and I've noticed this in the lives of just people I know, that if you have an intellectually dishonest worldview, your life goes along just great until it doesn't. Then when suddenly the bill comes due for all the times you told yourself that life is a song, or I'm just a piece of meat, or whatever, I can do anything to anybody I want, whatever you've told yourself, whatever lie you've told yourself, the bill comes due even in this world. And I think that intellectual dishonesty is pervasive, and the way you can tell it's pervasive is that people are always trying to get each other to shut up.
Yes.
It's like I raise an idea and then you raise an idea and I say, well, that's racist. Well, that's not an argument. The argument is, are you right or are you wrong? It's all trying to get people to shut up. And when people try to get you to shut up, it's because they're telling themselves a big lie and they don't want you to break through that lie.
And you know what? An added element here is it's not just dishonesty. It's this sort of punitive, persnickety, imposed politeness. Like I said, you bring up racist alt-right people are celebrating your central sacrament of abortion because it hurts blacks disproportionately. And they say, you just said blacks. We're not saying that this year.
That's right. It's all about shut up. I mean, almost everything when you look at what the left says, almost everything they say translates to shut up. You're racist, you're sexist, you're this, you're that. You're white, so you can't talk about black people's problems. You're a man, so you can't talk about women's problems. It's all about shut up. And why? Why would you want to shut people? I don't want to shut up the people who oppose me. I want them to talk, because I know I'm going to win that argument, and they want to shut you up because they are living a lie. And I think somewhere deep down, people know that. Yeah.
So do you think they're culpable? Are there a million zombies walking around who at some point in their past willingly became zombies?
Oh, wow. That's luckily, I don't think we have to make that judgment. What I think we have to do is reach our hands out and say, here's a better life. The judgment on that is going to be made at a higher pay grade than either you or I have. But I think what I say is, I think if you know that you're wreaking destruction, you're causing destruction, and you go forward and do that, there's got to be some culpability. But I think, again, so much of it goes back to this cloud of intellectual atmosphere that we all live in. And I think that atmosphere, for instance, makes it possible for a woman to get an abortion without really thinking about what she's doing, without really knowing what she's doing. And I think that I don't know how to pass judgment on that. I don't want to pass judgment on that. I just want it, if I can, to make it stop.
Amen. No, I think that's exactly right. And even culpability itself is something that's something of a wound, and we should have sympathy for people who are feeling guilt.
Yes.
But so one last thing, Andrew, I'm wondering, I was just talking with this friend of mine, and we had the idea, we need an anti-Hollywood. What do you think of that? Do you think that's a possible, because like new media, you're using it heavily. I try to use it as well. The idea of new media gets around the mainstream. It gets around the sort of dusty establishment institutions, including Hollywood, mainstream media, etc. And it puts out a realistic, if not conservative or libertarian point of view. And that is, I think, the space where the most beautiful art has the best chance of forming. What do you think of the possibilities of an anti-Hollywood, and are you part of that project at all?
I think I'm very much a part of that project. I think it's happening as we speak. I always joke that I'm the Zelig of this project because I keep turning up in every different possible technology there is. But I think that what I liken it to is the American Revolution. I think we have an empire, the empire of lies on our hands. And I think we are popping up from behind rocks and we're picking them off one by one. They have the movie studios, they have the magazines, they have the publishing houses. And yet we keep popping up. And with new things and new places, podcasts right now are a big way of speaking. YouTube for a while was a big way of speaking. I think that we are actually in the midst of this revolution. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I'm very hopeful that it's going to be a good outcome because I simply don't think you can create for very long or very acceptably in this atmosphere of lies, this atmosphere where people aren't human. It's the very premise of art that people are spirits. It's the very premise of art that there is something within each human being that is precious and important and unique and eternal. You can't make art without representing that, even if you don't believe it. And I think that they've tried very hard to push this other idea on us. And I just think it's humorless. It's dead. It's not human. And I think basically we're going to take the culture back in this kind of weird little revolutionary way.
That's awesome. One last thing I want to get to. I have to. All that you just mentioned isn't entirely absent from mainstream entertainment necessarily. When I watched Blade Runner 2049, I thought, what a coup. This is my worldview being depicted on the big screen in a mainstream movie.
Yeah.
See, in other words, it's not like Hollywood bad, we good, exclusively. Can you name some other examples of that, or at least how our audience can look for good material in mainstream content?
Yeah, I think Christopher Nolan, his movies are incredibly conservative. I think there was a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. The name of he was a trapper trying to find the guy who hurt his daughter. It was a revenge story, and the guy who made the movie is a deeply Catholic filmmaker. And when I pointed out that it was a Christian movie, I was attacked online by Christians for days on end because it was filled with bloodshed and hate and violence and bad language. And I thought, like life. It was filled with life,
Or the Bible.
Or the Bible. And I think that does happen. There's just no question about it. Hollywood is not, I've worked out here quite a lot, and it's not a monolithic place. There is a very powerful group of people who will try to blacklist you and will shut you down. And of course, it's such a glamorous business that anything that's working against you is going to hurt you very badly. But it's still not a monolithic place. There are plenty of good people out here. There are plenty of religious people out here. There are plenty of people here trying to do good stuff. And it does pop up from time to time, and more often than you think. Just in little movies, go back and watch the movie Toy Story 3, which I think is one of the best movies of the last 20 years.
Oh my gosh, I watched it with 4 grown men and we all wept.
I wept. I know.
Good.
It's a great picture. And I think that it does pop up and it is there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's awesome. This is a very hopeful interview. And thank you for that, Andrew. We're talking with the great Andrew Klavan, who can be found on the Andrew Klavan Show.
Yep. It's thedailywire.com.
Exactly. And you can also look into the new podcast, which is called Another Kingdom, correct?
That's it.
And that's your latest novel. You're going to be writing more novels and issuing them chapter at a time and in podcast style?
Yeah, this one is actually doing very well, Another Kingdom. And by the way, if people would subscribe on iTunes, it helps us a lot. But we just got a sponsor, and so I'm hoping it'll run at least 3 seasons. I'm hoping it'll be a trilogy. So I'm going forward with that. And I'm also in the middle of a novel that I hope to just publish. So I'm doing as much as I can.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And also, belated welcome to the Christian fold. Thank you for the conversion.
Well, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, so I appreciate it.
All right. Hope to talk to you again soon, Andrew. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks a lot.
Well, that's it for this week. You've been listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour. No immortal souls were harmed in the making of this episode. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid. See you next week.